Ada Fenwick was 42 years old and standing in the rain outside a house that no longer belonged to her, with $9 sewn into the hem of her only good coat and nowhere in the world left to go. Her brother-in-law, Silas Fenwick, had produced a debt paper bearing her late husband's signature, a signature she would later learn had never once been his. And with the county clerk's blessing, he had claimed the house, the boat, and the small chandlery that had fed 3 generations of Fenwicks on the coast of Maine. So Ada took what little she had and walked 11 miles up the shore road to the fishing town of Gull's Rest, where, at a tax auction held on the
By order of the court,
she paid
we are
$6
auctioning this
for a
property.
crumbling, decommissioned lighthouse
Up
that
for
the
sale
county had long
is the
since given up
abandoned
lighting.
lighthouse.
The men who watched her hand over the money laughed behind their hands, certain she had thrown away her last coins on a pile of stone and gold droppings. They did not know, and neither did she, that sealed inside the lantern room at the top of that tower was a weathered journal that would not only save her, but would quietly set right a wrong that had been rotting the heart of that town for 30 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Fenwick. If you're watching this from a place the world has written off as finished, tell us in the comments. Because sometimes the forgotten places are the ones still keeping the oldest promises. Ada had been raised, not in Gull's Rest, but 2 towns south, in a fishing household where her father had been a net mender and her mother had kept the ledgers for half the boats in the harbor because she was the only one who could add a column of figures without losing her place. It was from her mother, Constance, that Ada had learned the quiet, unglamorous skill that would define her entire life, the patient, unhurried art of reading paper. Not merely reading words, but reading the spaces between them. The way a column that didn't quite balance told a story just as clearly as any confession. The way an old contract's phrasing revealed who had written it and what they had been afraid of. Constance used to sit Ada down at the kitchen table with a lamp turned low to save oil, and together they would go through the fishermen's accounts, and her mother would say, "Numbers don't lie, Ada, but people arrange them to lie for them. Your job is to find the seam." Ada had thought, as a girl, that this was simply a chore, a way of being useful in a house with little money and 4 younger brothers to feed. It was only much later that she understood her mother had given her something rarer than an inheritance of land, an inheritance of attention. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, broad-shouldered fisherman named Peter Fenwick, whose family had lived along that stretch of Maine coastline since before the Revolution, and whose younger brother Silas had always regarded Peter's modest success. A sound boat, a small chandlery, a good name. With a resentment he wore thinly disguised as humor. Peter was not a wealthy man, but he was a steady one, and for 21 years Ada kept his books exactly as her mother had taught her, finding the seams in supplier invoices, catching a dishonest deckhand skimming from the catch counts, quietly making the difference between a family that scraped by and a family that thrived. She bore 2 children, a son who went west to work the railroads and a daughter who married a minister in Bangor, and though the house sometimes felt too quiet after they left, Ada found a steady contentment in her days, in the smell of drying nets, in the sound of Peter's boat engine coughing to life before dawn, in the particular satisfaction of a ledger that balanced to the penny. What she carried forward from all those years, more than any single skill, was a conviction her mother had planted early and life had only confirmed, which was this: nothing discarded is necessarily worthless, and no silence is necessarily innocent. A ledger set aside because it seemed to balance might be hiding a theft. A person cast out because they seemed foolish might be the only one paying attention. She did not know, standing in her warm kitchen all those years with her children underfoot, that this single conviction would one day be the only inheritance she had left, and that it would be enough. The fall came the way falls often do, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of small losses that only revealed themselves as a single catastrophe once it was too late to stop it. Peter died in the spring of 1896, when a sudden squall caught his boat 2 miles offshore and the engine failed at the worst possible moment. He was 51, and Ada had thought, in her grief, that at least the chandlery and the house were paid for outright, that whatever else happened, she, in the memory of him, would have a roof. She had not accounted for Silas. Silas Fenwick had spent 2 decades watching his older brother succeed at the modest scale their family had always managed, and he had spent those same 2 decades in and out of debts of his own, ventures that failed, a fishing partnership that soured, a reputation in town that had grown thin as old rope. Within 4 months of Peter's death, Silas appeared at Ada's door with a county lawyer and a promissory note, dated 11 years earlier. Bearing what appeared to be Peter's signature, claiming that Peter had borrowed heavily against the house and chandlery to cover Silas's failed partnership and had never repaid a cent. Ada knew, in the marrow of her bones, that this was a lie. Peter had never once in 21 years hidden a debt from her, had never once signed a paper she hadn't seen cross the kitchen table. But knowing a thing and proving it are different countries. And Ada had no proof, only certainty, and certainty does not hold up in a county courtroom against a signature and a lawyer's confident voice. The judge, an old friend of the Fenwick family in the loose way small towns produce old friends, ruled that the note appeared valid absent evidence otherwise, and gave Ada 60 days to satisfy the debt or vacate the property. She spent those 60 days doing everything a woman in her position could do. She wrote to her son in the West, who sent what little he could spare, which was not enough. She asked around the harbor for anyone who might remember Peter mentioning a debt to his brother, and found only uneasy silence, because Silas had a temper and long memory, and no one wanted to be the one who crossed him. She went through every drawer and strongbox in the house, searching for some paper of her own that might contradict the note, and found nothing, because a good forgery, she was beginning to understand, leaves no trace of what it replaces. On the 59th day, she packed what she could carry, left the rest behind because there was no cart to carry it and no money to hire one, and walked north along the shore road with her $9 and her mother's old conviction that nothing discarded is necessarily worthless, though on that particular gray afternoon it was cold comfort indeed. Gull's Rest, when she reached it, was a town in its own quiet decline, though a gentler one than her own. It had once been a modestly prosperous harbor, its fishing fleet larger than its neighbors, its wharf busier, owing, as she would later learn, to an old arrangement that had funneled a share of shipping and salvage fees into the town's upkeep. But the lighthouse at Gull's Point, which had guided ships past the wicked shoal offshore since before anyone living could remember, had been decommissioned 8 years prior when the county replaced it with an automated light on a steel skeleton tower a half-mile down the coast, cheaper to maintain and requiring no keeper at all. The old stone tower had simply been abandoned, its keeper's cottage collapsing slowly into its own foundation, and it sat now on a scrap of county land nobody wanted, assessed for unpaid taxes that nobody expected anyone to pay. The auction was a small, almost embarrassed affair, held on the courthouse steps with perhaps a dozen men in attendance, most of them there for a parcel of timberland being sold the same afternoon. When the auctioneer read out the lighthouse parcel, there was a ripple of laughter, because everyone in Gull's Rest knew the tower was worth nothing. The lens had been removed years ago and sold for scrap. The stairs were rotten in places. The cottage was fit only for gulls. Ada, standing at the back with her $9, felt something in her mother's old lesson stir. The sense that a thing dismissed too easily by everyone else was often the thing worth a second look. And when the bidding, such as it was, stalled at $5, she raised her hand and said $6, and no one bothered to top her. The auctioneer looked almost sorry for her as he took her money and handed over the deed. She walked up to the tower that same afternoon, in fading light, half expecting to find nothing but a place to sleep out of the rain, which by itself would have been worth $6 to a woman with nowhere else to go. The cottage was indeed too far gone to shelter in. Its roof caved on one side, but the tower itself, built of granite blocks 100 years earlier by men who had built things to last centuries rather than decades, stood solid despite its neglect. She climbed the spiral stairs slowly, testing each step, past landings thick with dust and gull feathers and the dry husks of old lamp oil tins, until she reached the lantern room at the top, where the great lens had once stood and where now there was only a rusted iron frame and a floor gritty with salt and years. It was in a gap behind the loose base of that iron frame, wedged where a keeper might have hidden something he wanted found only by someone patient enough to look, that Ada's hand closed on a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with waxed cord gone brittle with age. She sat right there on the cold floor of the lantern room, with the last gray light of evening coming through the salt fog glass, and unwrapped it, and found a journal, its leather cover swollen with old damp, its pages foxed at the edges but still legible, belonging, according to the careful hand on its first page, to one Thomas Mercer, keeper of Gull's Point Light, beginning in the year 1861. She might, on any other night, have set it aside for morning and gone looking for a dry corner to sleep in. But something in the opening lines caught her the way a seam in a ledger catches an eye trained to look for one, and she read on by the last of the daylight, and then by a stub of candle she found among her own meager possessions, and what she found, over the following days, would change not only her own fortunes but the fortunes of the entire town that had laughed as she paid her $6. Thomas Mercer's journal was, for its first 100 pages, an ordinary keeper's record: weather, ships sighted, oil consumption, the small triumphs and hardships of a solitary post on a lonely point. But as Ada read on, sitting wrapped in her coat against the tower's chill, she began to understand that Thomas Mercer had been more than a keeper of the light. He had also, in the earliest years of his post, served as the informal collector of what the town called the Point Fund, an arrangement apparently established by the town's founders and never formally written into county law, whereby a small percentage of every cargo that passed safely by Gull's Point, and a larger percentage of any salvage recovered from wrecks on the shoal, was set aside not for the county nor for any private owner, but for the town itself, for the widows of drowned fishermen, for the school when the herring runs failed, for whatever hardship the sea, sooner or later, always visited on a harbor town. Mercer had kept this fund faithfully for nearly 2 decades, recording every contribution in a second, more careful hand at the back of his journal, a hand that grew increasingly urgent and increasingly troubled in its final pages. For in 1879, Mercer wrote, the town's newly appointed harbor commissioner, a man named Josiah Bram, had proposed, with great persuasive warmth, that the Point Fund be formalized under his office for safekeeping, rather than left in the informal custody of a lighthouse keeper who might, after all, grow old or die or simply vanish with the town's money. The town council, trusting a man of Bram's standing, had agreed, and the fund's records and its accumulated silver had been transferred into Josiah Bram's keeping. Mercer's journal recorded, in increasingly anxious entries, that he had never again seen an accounting of the fund made public, that requests from grieving widows for assistance were quietly turned away by Bram's office, citing insufficient funds. Even as the harbor commissioner's own household grew visibly more prosperous, his house painted and expanded, his daughters married off with handsome dowries the town could not account for. Mercer, growing old and increasingly certain that Josiah Bram had simply absorbed the Point Fund into his own estate, had begun keeping a private, parallel accounting of what he believed the fund's true balance ought to be, cross-referenced against shipping records he obtained from the customs house, in the patient, methodical hand of a man building a case he feared he would not live to present. His final entry, dated the winter of 1881, read simply that his health was failing, that he trusted no one in the town government enough to hand over his findings while Bram still held office, and that he was sealing this record in the one place he was certain no one would think to look, the lantern room itself, above the reach of ordinary curiosity, in the hope that someday someone patient enough would find it and finish what he had not been able to. Ada sat with that final entry for a long while in the cold lantern room, and she thought of her mother's voice at the kitchen table. Numbers don't lie, but people arrange them to lie for them. Your job is to find the seam. She thought, too, with a bitterness she allowed herself only briefly, of Silas Fenwick and his forged note, of how the same trick, a respected man's signature standing in for the truth, had been used to rob both a lighthouse keeper's town and a fisherman's widow, 30 years and 80 miles apart, and how in both cases the only remedy had been a woman patient enough to read what others hadn't bothered to. She spent her first weeks in Gull's Rest in a manner that struck the townspeople as eccentric even by the standards they'd already applied to the woman who'd paid $6 for a ruin. She patched the cottage roof herself with materials scavenged from the wreck of an old fish house, made herself a home there sparse but dry, and took in mending and account-keeping for the harbor's boat owners to earn her bread, quietly demonstrating the same careful competence with figures that had once made her indispensable in her own household. But her evenings, and increasingly her days, she spent at the county customs house and the harbor master's records, cross-referencing Thomas Mercer's careful old entries against whatever original shipping and salvage documents from the 1860s and 1870s still survived, painstakingly reconstructing the very case the old keeper had died unable to finish. What she found, entry by patient entry, confirmed and then exceeded Mercer's worst suspicions. Josiah Bram, dead now some 15 years, his position and, as it happened, his considerable remaining fortune inherited by his son, Elias Bram, who now served as Gull's Rest harbor commissioner in his father's old office and lived in his father's expanded house, had over the course of roughly a decade diverted what Ada's careful reconstruction suggested was somewhere near $4,000 of the Point Fund into his own accounts, an almost unimaginable sum for a town that size in that era, money that should have gone to widows' pensions, to the town school, to the very sort of hardship relief that might have kept families like Ada's own from ever needing to walk a shore road with $9 and nowhere to go. She began, cautiously, to make discreet inquiries around town, A question here about old Commissioner Bram's finances. A conversation there with an elderly widow who remembered being turned away from the harbor office in her hour of need, and found, gathering slowly like a tide, a whole submerged history of a town's quiet suffering that its most prosperous family had built its comfort upon. It did not take long for Elias Bram to hear that the strange widow who'd bought the old lighthouse had taken an unusual interest in his father's old records, and when he did not react with alarm so much as with the smooth, practiced condescension of a man who had never once in his life been seriously questioned. He called on her himself at the lighthouse, dressed in a fine coat entirely unsuited to the climb up the shore path, and suggested, pleasantly, but with an edge beneath the pleasantness that Ada recognized instantly, having heard its close cousin in Silas Fenwick's voice, that a woman alone, new to town, ought to be careful about the kind of talk she encouraged, that old records were easily misread by those unfamiliar with how such funds actually worked, and that it would be a shame if her modest efforts to make a living mending accounts for the town's boat owners were to be complicated by her acquiring a reputation as a troublemaker. Ada thanked him for his concern with a courtesy that gave away nothing, and after he left, she sat for a long time in the lantern room with Thomas Mercer's journal open on her lap, and found that his visit, rather than frightening her, had confirmed everything the old keeper had died believing. The weeks that followed were harder than Ada had expected, for Elias Bram. Once he understood, she would not be quietly discouraged, moved with the patient thoroughness of a man protecting an inheritance he had never questioned the origins of. Two of the boat owners who had been paying Ada for account work found reasons to take their ledgers elsewhere, and Ada suspected, without proof, that a quiet word from the harbor commissioner's office had something to do with it. A rumor began circulating that the strange widow at the old lighthouse had been asking odd questions because she herself was in some kind of trouble with the law back where she'd come from. A rumor with just enough shape to it that Ada wondered, with a cold feeling, whether Silas Fenwick's name had somehow traveled north ahead of her, though she never learned for certain if that was true or simply the town's own instinct to suspect the outsider. The elderly widow who had spoken to her about being turned away from the harbor office grew frightened and asked Ada not to repeat what she'd said, having a grown son who still needed the harbor commissioner's goodwill for his fishing license. For a time, standing alone in her rebuilt cottage with a lighthouse full of proof and a town too afraid or too indebted to stand beside her, Ada felt the particular loneliness of being right and unable to matter. But she had, after all, spent 21 years learning that a case built patiently on paper does not need the town's courage to be true, only its eventual willingness to look, and she had spent her whole life learning that the seam, once found, does not close itself back up simply because someone powerful wishes it would. She wrote, with great care, a full and precise account of her findings. Thomas Mercer's original entries, her own reconstruction from the customs records, a running total of the diverted funds with every figure sourced and dated, and rather than take it to the town council, whose members she suspected owed Elias Bram more favors than she could counter, she sent copies, quietly and simultaneously, to the State Harbor Authority in Portland, to a newspaper in Bangor known for its interest in official corruption, and to a maritime attorney whose name she found listed as having once represented a fishing cooperative in a dispute with the county, on the theory that a claim strong enough to interest a lawyer working on behalf of many fishermen might survive contact with Elias Bram's influence better than her voice alone. The response, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic confrontation but as the slow, grinding machinery of official attention finally turning where it had been pointed. A state auditor arrived in Gull's Rest that autumn, ostensibly reviewing harbor accounts as a routine matter, though Ada suspected the newspaper's inquiries had a great deal to do with the timing. The auditor's review, cross-checked against the very customs records Ada had already combed through, confirmed within weeks what Thomas Mercer had died certain of, and what Ada had spent months proving beyond argument. The Point Fund had indeed been diverted, decades earlier, into the personal estate of Josiah Bram, an estate that had passed largely intact to his son. The Bangor newspaper ran the story under a headline about a lighthouse keeper's long-buried ledger, and for the first time in 15 years, the people of Gull's Rest spoke openly, in the harbor and at the general store, about things they had long only whispered, about widows quietly turned away, about a harbor commissioner's suspiciously handsome house, about a fund everyone had assumed simply didn't exist anymore rather than one that had been stolen. Elias Bram did not go to prison, for the theft, however clearly documented, had been committed by his father, and the law was uncertain what to demand of an inheriting son who had merely failed to ask hard questions about where his comfort came from. But the state authority, backed now by public pressure the newspaper story had made impossible to ignore, required the restoration of the fund's value, with accumulated interest to be paid from the Bram estate into a newly reconstituted point fund, administered no longer by any single office, but by a board that included, at the insistence of the maritime attorney Ada had written to, the widow who had first spoken to her, and 2 other townspeople with no connection to harbor politics. Elias Bram resigned his commission within the month, his family's long unquestioned standing in Gull's Rest quietly and permanently diminished, not by violence or vengeance, but by the simple, unglamorous fact of an accounting finally being made to balance. Ada herself asked for nothing from the restored fund beyond what she had already earned honestly through her mending work, though the reconstituted board, over her objections, voted to award her a finder's commission that she ultimately accepted only on the condition that most of it be directed toward repairing the very lighthouse cottage she had been living in, so that it might one day serve, as she proposed, as a small schoolhouse and community room for the harbor's children, a use Thomas Mercer, she felt certain, would have approved of far more than any museum to his own memory. The Point Fund, restored and now properly administered, began that winter to do the work it had been built for 30 years earlier. A widow's medical bill quietly covered, a fishing family's roof repaired after a storm, a scholarship fund established for children who wanted to learn more than their harbor town could otherwise teach them. Ada made sure, before the matter closed, that a copy of Thomas Mercer's journal was preserved properly in the county archive, his name restored to the town's memory not as a footnote, but as the patient, careful keeper who had refused to let a theft go unrecorded even when he could not live to see it corrected. As for Silas Fenwick, Ada never returned south to confront him directly, but she did right. Once the Gull's Rest matter was settled and her name had appeared, briefly and respectfully, in the Bangor paper's account of it, a careful letter to the county clerk who had originally approved his forged note, enclosing what she had since learned about handwriting analysis from the maritime attorney's correspondence and requesting, formally, that the note be re-examined. She never learned the full outcome, for she had, by then, built a life in Gull's Rest she had no wish to leave. But she did hear, second-hand and much later, that Silas's fortunes had grown considerably thinner once questions began quietly circulating about the debts of a man who had once produced a suspiciously convenient promissory note against his own brother's estate. And she found that this news, when it reached her, brought her less satisfaction than simple peace, which was, she decided, very likely the better thing to feel. And so it was that Ada Fenwick, 42 years old, cast out by a brother-in-law's forged debt and left with $9 and nowhere to go, became the keeper, in every sense but the official one, of the very lighthouse she had bought for $6 because everyone else had judged it worthless. The tower that the men on the courthouse steps had laughed at now held, once again, a light of a different kind, not the great lens that used to warn ships from the shoal, but a small schoolroom in its repaired cottage, a restored fund quietly mending the harbor's oldest wounds, and the memory of a careful keeper named Thomas Mercer, who had trusted that somewhere, someday, a patient enough person would find what he had left behind. Ada had inherited her mother's gift for finding the seam in a column of figures that didn't quite balance, and it had cost her everything twice over before it finally gave everything back, not to her alone, but to the whole quiet, struggling town that had once seen only a foolish widow paying too much attention to a pile of forgotten stone. We tell you Ada's story not because $6 and an old journal make for a tidy ending, though they do, but because of what she chose to do once the ending was hers to write. She could have kept Thomas Mercer's secret and the silver it implied entirely for herself, and no one, given what had been taken from her, could have blamed her for it. Instead, she spent her hard-won knowledge rebuilding the very kind of quiet safety net that might have spared her own family's ruin, had one existed on her own stretch of coast. That, more than the lighthouse, more than the journal, more than the $6 that started it all, is the real inheritance of this story. The understanding that what looks worthless to a crowd in a hurry is sometimes only waiting for someone patient enough to really look. Thank you for spending this time with Ada and the light at Gull's Point. If her story reminded you that hope can survive even the fiercest storms, we'd be honored if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that quiet patience can outlast even the loudest injustice. Before you leave, help us keep these forgotten stories alive by tapping the like button, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notification bell. Every click tells YouTube that stories of courage, redemption, and hidden history deserve to reach more people, and it helps us continue uncovering remarkable tales like Ada's. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something, or someone, that everyone else had already given up on, only to realize it was far more valuable than anyone imagined? Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experiences often inspire the stories we tell next. And don't let the journey end here. Click the next video on your screen and uncover another forgotten life, another hidden secret, and another extraordinary ending waiting to be found. Until next time, remember this: the world often overlooks its greatest treasures simply because they've been hidden the longest. Stay curious, stay hopeful, and we'll see you in the next story.